And Katrina, thank you for the kind introduction, Elle, for having me speak to you all as well today. So the topic I wanted to talk about today is about the importance of energy independence and economic prosperity. And that topic is important for a variety of reasons, but there are three in particular that I think are worth highlighting. The first is the increased cost of energy overall, and that's a direct consequence of decisions that have been made for decades in Washington and in Austin to artificially restrict our nation and our state's ability to extract and exploit our God-given natural resources. So if you think all the way back to 2019 and President Trump's first term, the United States became for the first time ever the world's largest producer of oil and gas, larger than Russia, Venezuela, or any of the Gulf states. Fast forward a year, and during the Democratic primaries, then candidate Joe Biden promised to end the oil and gas industry as we know it if elected. And once in office, that's exactly what he sought to do. On day one, he issued executive orders to cancel the Keystone Pipeline, while simultaneously providing approval for the Nord 2 pipeline, allowing Russia to ship cheap natural gas into Western Europe, fueling an addiction, which helped lead directly to the Ukrainian conflict. He canceled leases on federal lands for the development of oil and natural gas. He took nearly 1 million acres offline in the American West, home to sensitive uranium deposits. He canceled permits for LNG export facilities all along the Gulf Coast, and he appointed regulators who are openly hostile to the industry. In just the first few weeks of the second Trump administration, many of those orders have been reversed, but the damage is already done, and the results were totally predictable. Today, capital is relatively dried up for the industry. We produce barely more today than we did several years back, despite an increased capacity and willingness to do so. And ironically, the only beneficiaries of this perverse set of policies have been the oil and gas companies, which today are making record profits because reduced supply has increased prices. There's also the increased cost of energy dependence. The United States has over 200 years worth of known natural gas deposits. We have enough coal to power this country for 1,000 years. It's simply inexcusable that we should have to be in the position of begging, hat in hand, third world tin pot dictators who happen to sit on top of gas stations to provide us with energy when we have everything that we need right below our feet. And then finally, to the extent that the country and our state are producing energy, too much of it is coming from unreliable sources, which makes blackouts, brownouts, conservation notices, including today, this week, becoming increasingly frequent occurrences. Of course, Winter Storm Uri in 2021 here, every summer and winter in California and across the American South in the last year. And it just begs the question, why does this keep happening? Now I would submit it's because reasonable people have just entirely disengaged from this debate. But it's an axiomatic truth that whenever there's a vacuum, something has to fill that void. It was Blaise Pascal who famously said that there is a God-sized shaped hole in everybody's heart. It's just a question of what's going to fill into that hole. And into that void, the left has been incredibly aggressive and successful at pushing their own policy ideas and jargon. You got DEI, ESG, renewables, the Green New Deal, but all of these are false secular idols. They're not based on what's in the best interest of the American people or our state or prosperity. They're based on a false search for purpose and meaning. But all the while, they're deeply destructive to our national growth and prosperity. They're harmful to our investment returns by artificially prioritizing virtue signaling at the expense of maximizing shareholder value, and they're deeply destructive to our quality of life. But today, all we've really done is criticize the most absurd aspects of these policies, like the idea that you could somehow ban cows from farting, or that you could ban private aircraft traffic. Those ideas are ridiculous, they should be mocked, but if you don't have a positive, affirmative agenda for what people can believe in, and you just criticize the excesses of the other side, you risk losing and not gaining the type of popular support that's needed to make the changes that are required, as we saw during the 2022 election. And even this most recent election was much closer than it needed to be. So the answer for us as a state and as a country should be to embrace the twin pillars of energy independence and economic prosperity. That begins by embracing the power of abundance. We must have more power, but it has to come from reliable sources of energy. That means ending the wasteful subsidies for wind and solar. Let them compete on their own merit. We need to encourage more fossil fuels, more natural gas, and unapologetically more coal. And we have to have more nuclear power. So where does Texas, where do we get our power from? The plurality source of power in our state is natural gas, about 40% of our grid. And that's in part because Texas is home to a quarter of the nation's known oil and gas reserves. Second is actually wind. On average, about 25% of our grid. In the summer months, it's substantially higher, and in the winter months, like today, it's often significantly lower. And a lot of people don't realize, but today it's Texas. It's not California, it's not Massachusetts, New York, or any of the other states. Texas is the largest producer of wind energy in this country by far. And that has major public policy ramifications, as we'll get to. Third is coal, at about 20% of our grid, but that continues to decline as it's substituted with cheaper, more abundant natural gas. Fourth is nuclear power, at about 8% of our grid. And that comes from 4 reactors in total. We have 2 in Comanche Peak, which is in Glen Rose, Texas, just west of Fort Worth. And then there are 2 more at the South Texas Project in Bay City, Texas, along the coast. Those 4 reactors were built, constructed, and completed in the late 1970s and early 80s. And yet today they still provide power for nearly 1 out of every 10 Texans, over 3 million homes. And then finally you have solar at about 5% of our grid. But that number is scheduled to double over the course of the next decade. And what's interesting is if you look at those percentages and you compare them to the country overall, we are massively overweight unreliable source of energy relative to the rest of the country. So Texas and the country as a whole, we get about 60% of our power from fossil fuels. But the country gets 20% of its energy from nuclear. We're less than half of that. And the country only gets 20% from quote-unquote renewables. But nearly half of that is from hydroelectric power, which, setting aside whatever the environmental consequences are of that, that is an extremely reliable form of energy. But in Texas, we don't have that. So we're massively over-leveraged in that space. And one of the consequences of that is that because we are so heavily weighted to weather-dependent, unreliable sources of energy, electricity rates in Texas are often substantially higher than what they are in other states that lack our God-given resources, but yet have made better public policy choices to weight their grids towards more reliable sources. States like Florida, which in case have 30 to 40% cheaper electricity rates than we do here in Texas. It just begs the question, why are nuclear power, which is 100% clean and 100% reliable, and natural gas, which is cheap, abundant, and plentiful, why are those not the bases of our national economic renaissance? And the answer is because the left has been incredibly successful at substituting their own policy agenda forward. And they're very clear about what they want to do. They're not hiding the ball. They want to ban fossil fuels, they want to limit nuclear power, and they want to provide endless subsidies for wind and solar at the expense of everything else. The problem is that this anti-fossil fuel, anti-nuclear, anti-growth agenda is deeply destructive to our American national interest, and so it's imperative that we start telling the truth and stop referring to these policies by the left's preferred pronouns, which is that wind and solar, they're weather-dependent, unreliable sources of energy that will never be able to provide for our state or our nation's growth and prosperity. It is a lie to suggest that wind and solar would ever be able to fully replace fossil fuels. We have spent decades and trillions of dollars attempting to subsidize these sources of fuel, and yet today they provide less than 5% of the world's energy needs. If you added up all the battery technology in the country, it would power us for less than 10 seconds. Today, fossil fuels provide over 85% of the world's energy needs. Even under the most optimistic green scenario, which you would have to suspend belief and believe that countries like India and China, Russia and Brazil would magically adhere to their Paris Climate Accord obligations, which are worth less than the piece of paper that they're written on. Even under those most optimistic scenarios, fossil fuels will still be required to provide over 75% of the world's energy needs well into this century, well past 2040. They're not going away. We should be embracing them, not disclaiming them. These policies have also resulted in a reduced use of nuclear power. As recently as the 1990s, over 20% of the world's energy needs came from nuclear. Today, that number is less than half. And yet, in the last 20 to 30 years, we've had incredible technological achievements. We're able to send people into space and have them return on reusable rockets that are caught by chopsticks on a landing pad. You've got artificial intelligence, large language models that provide answers better than most college PhD graduates. When I was in high school, Al Gore invented the internet. But these incredible technologies, we should be embracing them. But the result is that you've got countries around the globe, states here in the United States, which have made their grids less reliable and dirtier. As recently as last decade, France got over 70% of its power from nuclear. In the last several years, Germany has closed their last remaining nuclear power plants. Today, their electricity rates are nearly double what they were a decade ago. And you've got states in the United States, California, New York, Vermont, that have already passed or are in the process of passing closures to their last remaining nuclear power plants. The result is that the European Union emits more than they ever have. Today, China, which by far is the world's largest polluter, they have no qualms about what they're doing. So all you've got fools in the West twiddling and complaining about whether to use plastic or paper straws. They've already published plans. They're going to build 300 new coal-fired power plants over the next several decades. That's a pace of 1 a week. But they're also going to be building 150 new Generation 4 small modular nuclear reactors. And that's because whatever the drawbacks are of the Chinese Communist Party, and there are many, they at least understand that if they want to stay in power, they have to provide cheap, reliable energy to their people. And so the result is that today, there is no large industrialized country on earth that has met their Paris obligations, except for one, the United States, which despite not being a party to those agreements throughout, and we should never rejoin it, we've actually cut our emissions since 2000 by over 20%, 800 million metric tons, more than the entire European Union combined because we embraced the hydraulic fracturing revolution. We maintain nuclear power at roughly the same percentage. And since 2004, the United States, we have cut our emissions, not because of some government bureaucrat or some mandate of some pinhead sitting in Brussels or DC or in Austin, but due to the technological and innovative capacity of the American people. We have cut our emissions by over 1% a year. That's an incredible accomplishment. It should be praised. It should be lauded. And it's a rejoinder to the lies that the left tells about this country. We should also be open and honest about the drawbacks of these technologies. Start with the environmental consequences. According to the Sierra Club, not the American Petroleum Institute or AFPI or the Heritage Foundation, the Sierra Club, millions of migratory birds and animals are killed each year by the rotating propeller blades and hot reflective solar panels. And the rare earth minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel that are required for batteries, solar panels, and wind turbines, they're incredibly energy intensive and ecologically destructive to mine. Set aside for a moment the fact that they happen to be found in countries that hate us, like China, Russia, Afghanistan. Over 50% of the world's known nickel supply is found in the sensitive rainforests of Indonesia, where in order to excavate for a single mine requires clear-cutting so much pristine forest, it releases the carbon equivalent of 12,000 cars idling on a highway. These are not clean sources of power. Wind and solar also lack what's known as energy density. That's a fancy way of saying the amount of power that can be generated from a given unit of a resource. Nuclear power is the most energy-dense resource known to man, but fossil fuels are a very close second. Just to illustrate the discrepancy, in order to approximate the same amount of power that can be generated from 1 square mile of a nuclear power plant, you would need 75 square miles of solar panels. That's more than 3 times the size of the island of Manhattan. And all the while, that land can't be used for human development, agriculture, recreation. It can't even be used by wildlife. And then at the end of the 15 to 20, 25-year useful life cycle of those solar panels, they can't be put in a recycle bin. They're going straight in a landfill where the toxic metals and plastics leak back into the groundwater and the soil. Compare that to nuclear power. If you've seen Oppenheimer, it's a good movie. It's been around since the 1940s. Today, there are, at any given time, between 95 to 100 nuclear power plants operational in the country. And every year, they produce about 2,000 metric tons of spent fuel rod waste. It has to be stored safely, but becomes less radioactive over time. In total, since 1940 through present, stored around the country, there are about 100,000 metric tons of spent fuel rod waste. It might sound like a really big number, and it is. But if you could gather it in a single location, it could fit in a single football field less than 15 yards high. That is a fraction of the amount of waste that's produced by any other power source, even on an annual basis. And so when you consider the total life cycle cost from mining to operation to development to the eventual decommissioning of a power plant, you often find that the carbon emissions from wind and solar are significantly higher than what they are certainly for nuclear, but even of fossil fuels. There was a study a couple of years back in the Wall Street Journal that found that in the first 5 years of ownership of a Tesla, you'd be responsible for more emissions than if you drove a traditional internal combustion engine car. And listen, I love Elon Musk. I think he's a phenomenal innovator. He's a modern-day Da Vinci. All of us in this room, we owe him a debt of gratitude for preserving some fraction of free speech in this country. And this isn't even a criticism of Teslas. They're beautiful cars. Everyone's trying to copy them. It's simply to state that if you're asking the American people to make a theological conversion like this, which is exactly what this is, you have an obligation to be open and honest about the costs and consequences. That brings us to the biggest drawback of wind and solar, which is that they are not scalable. When you need more power, like what we're going to need this week, you can't huff and puff on a wind turbine. You can't shine an iPhone flashlight on a solar panel. And that makes them fundamentally unreliable, which means that when there is an inevitable weather-related emergency, like what there is this week, it's the taxpayer, it's the ratepayer that's left holding the bag. But fossil fuels and nuclear power, they solve nearly every one of those problems. And yet by foolishly fetishizing wind and solar at the expense of everything else, we've set the stage for today's modern energy predicament. And the result of decades of poor public policy was felt most acutely here in Texas during Winter Storm Uri of January to February of 2021, when 2 inches of snow and ice, 2 inches of snow and ice, brought the state to its knees, resulted in the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of our fellow Texans and citizens, and made us a domestic and international laughingstock, even worse than the Dallas Mavericks front office. I remember when I lost power at my house, I sent a picture to my law school classmate, my roommate. He grew up in Cleveland. I felt embarrassed. That amount of snow is like a day ending in Y for somebody who grows up in the Midwest, but that's the circumstance we found ourselves in. And the Democrats and their acolytes in the media, I know I repeat myself with that, they didn't rest on their laurels. They used that as an opportunity to argue that the reason that we lost power was because we were too reliant on fossil fuels, that we needed to further embrace and accelerate our adoption of the Green New Deal. And since every election they've won, that is exactly what they've sought to do. One of the most important pieces of legislation that Joe Biden passed was the $1.7 trillion Inflation Reduction Act. One of the most inaptly named pieces of legislation in the history of the American Congress. We know that it triggered 9% levels of inflation, blew out our long-term debts and deficits, of which we're going to be paying the consequences for decades to come. That's because that wasn't an economic deal. That was a Green New Deal in disguise. It provided billions of dollars in subsidies for the development of wind turbines, solar panels, batteries, billions to people who can already afford it, to subsidize the purchase of electric vehicles, next to nothing for the nuclear industry, zero for fossil fuels, and next to nothing in terms of necessary permitting reform for the development of transmission lines and grid technology. But they did find time to tell you that you can't use a natural gas stove to cook the food that you want. It's not just that these policies are backwards and harmful, it's that they're totally ineffective. Even if we were able to convert every car in the country to an electric vehicle by the end of the next decade, it would reduce global emissions by less than 0.18% at the cost of trillions of dollars and millions of jobs lost. But in the process, we've made our grids less reliable. And that's because for decades, politicians in Washington and in Austin, on a bipartisan basis, this has not been a uniparty thing, this has been both parties, they have artificially subsidized wind and solar to the tune of billions of dollars in the form of tax credits and subsidies. In fact, one of those tax credits was a 313 tax abatement, was only allowed to expire in Texas in 2022. But the damage is already done. Today, Texas is the largest producer of wind energy in the country. Since 2015, we've added over 20,000 megawatts of energy to our grid. A megawatt can power anywhere from 500 to 1,000 homes. Nearly all of that has been wind and solar, next to none of it from fossil fuels, zero from new nuclear power. And 80% of the scheduled power projects to come online and be added to the Texas grid in the next several decades are wind and solar projects. We've done it to ourselves, we are continuing to do it. So what happened during Winter Storm Uri? During the coldest point of the storm, over 50% of the wind turbines in our state froze. Wind operated at less than 3% of its installed capacity. You go back and read postmortems from Democrats and the media, and they will constantly repeat the refrain that the reason that we had blackouts was because natural gas lost more power than wind. That is a lie by omission. The only reason that is true, it is a fact that natural gas lost more power than wind, but only because it produced so much more power than wind that even a small percentage decline of a large number is still a very large number. It's like saying 10% of 100 is greater than 50% of 10. But those are the lies that they use to try to trick you. And yes, a number of gas lines in the state did freeze, and the power plants need to be held accountable for their negligence and correct that moving forward. But let's be very clear about what happened during the course of the storm. During the coldest 3 weeks, natural gas production increased by 450%. Coal increased by 47%. Wind declined by 93%. And throughout the entire course of the storm, according to ERCOT, which is a public utility regulator in the state, it was nuclear power that was the most reliable form of energy, operating at over 80% of its installed capacity. No other power source was close. Natural gas was next in the 60s, which just goes to show you how important and necessary nuclear power is to the reliability of our grid. But in Texas, we've already crossed the Rubicon, because today we are fundamentally reliant on unreliable sources of energy that don't operate half the day, that are significantly less efficient during periods of extreme weather, to provide a significant component of our baseload required daily energy needs. And so it's no longer a question of if, but rather when we'll have continued blackouts, God forbid, or conservation notices like we're having this week. The only answer is that we need more energy, period, but it has to come from reliable sources. That means ending the wasteful subsidies for wind and solar, and going one step further to correct the imbalance. Make them incorporate the cost of providing the required backup power, which are almost always natural gas power plants. So if you want to purchase it, you're going to pay for it, not shunt that cost onto the taxpayers and ratepayers. We need to incentivize more natural gas, more coal, more fossil fuels. We need to cut the regulatory red tape to allow for the development of more nuclear power. And so the key for people who care deeply about the future of our state and our country is to stay engaged. That's because the left understands the fundamental transformative power of language. You're familiar with their euphemisms that they seemingly concoct on a near daily basis, plucking out of thin air. DEI, ESG, white privilege, gender-affirming care, undocumented migrant, unhoused person, that they expect you to use. Problem is that the moment you use it, you've already lost. So, question that comes up frequently in this vein is, do you believe in global warming or climate change or whatever they're choosing to call it on a given week? Well, that's not a simple yes or no question. It has multiple parts that should be thought of and answered thoughtfully. The first is, has the ambient temperature of the planet changed? Of course it has. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. We've had ice ages. We've had volcanic eruptions. 150 million years ago, an asteroid hit the Earth and killed off the dinosaurs. And yeah, in the last 150 years or so, since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, there has been, at best, about a 2-degree increase Fahrenheit in the ambient temperature of the planet. Which begs the second more important question, which is how much of that increase is due to mankind's activity versus natural causes. And we may never know the definitive answer to that question. But let's at least submit, for sake of argument, that human beings, we have the capacity to modify the environment around us. So maybe we're responsible for maybe we're responsible for every bit of that increase. We have to stop and reframe this entire debate. Because the purpose of public policy is not to cut carbon emissions. It's to implement and incentivize those policies that maximize human prosperity and flourishing. That begins by embracing and restating unapologetically a cardinal truth, which is that fossil fuels are necessary. They are good for mankind. They are a necessity. They are not a luxury. Over that same 150-year period, the average human lifespan at the end of the 1800s was 35 years old. Today, even in the poorest countries on Earth, that frequently exceeds 70 years of age, which means that in just over a century, the average human lifespan has doubled. That is a direct result of the availability, the medical, technological, and agricultural innovations made possible by cheap, reliable fossil fuels. Today, there are 98% fewer climate-related deaths than there were 100 years ago. 8 times more people die of the cold than die of the heat. There are fewer acres of forest that are burned today than even 2-3 decades ago. And the vast majority of forest fires that occur today, including those that tragically burned down half of Los Angeles, they're not due to climate change. They're due to arson and a failure to actively manage and prune those forests. There are fewer Atlantic Ocean hurricanes today and at lower intensity than there were 100 years ago. There are more polar bears today than have been counted in decades. And more of the Earth's surface area today is covered by greenery than at any point in recorded human history, because carbon dioxide is plant food. But you won't hear any of those facts. They're all facts because they run contrary to the prevailing narrative. But here are the only important facts that should ever come up in this debate. There are 3 billion people on Earth today that lack access to reliable drinking water or to electricity. They use dung and firewood as their primary methods of heating and cooking. There are 800 million people, including many in our country and in our state, that use less energy on a daily basis than the average American refrigerator does. And those people, one day, God willing, or certainly their kids, will reach the middle class. And when they do, they will not have time to sit on their ass waiting for the sun to shine or for the wind to blow. So no, unapologetically, it is not an existential crisis that there has been a modest increase in the Earth's temperature over nearly 2 centuries. What is an existential crisis is how do we ensure that the United States of America remains the last best hope of mankind? How do we ensure continued human prosperity and growth? Because if we lose that, then we will lose everything. But if you don't go back and answer that original question with yes, and that you support the policies they want, these people have the temerity to call you an anti-science bigot. That's despite these are the same people that don't believe in the science of hydraulic fracturing or nuclear power. They don't believe in the basic biological fact that life begins at conception. They think that there are no biological distinctions between boys and girls. Think they should change in the same locker rooms, compete in the same sports. They tried to convince you that forcing your 2-year-old toddler to wear a piece of cloth over their face would prevent them from contracting an airborne respiratory virus. And these are the same people who today believe that a virus that was created in a laboratory in Wuhan, China, which, by the way, they still think came from eating a pangolin at a wet market, that it won't infect you if you're a BLM or Antifa rioter causing $3.5 billion worth of property damage, destroying, vandalizing precious American monuments and cities in the process. But it would find you, and it would infect you, if you were peacefully protesting in favor of keeping your business open. You were a concerned parent at a school board meeting demanding that your child's school be kept open and demanding that they learn reading, writing, arithmetic, and the proper contextual history of this country rather than being indoctrinated with garbage like radical gender ideology or critical race theory. No, they are the anti-science bigots whose false secular idols must be challenged. There's an entire political party outside this room that proclaims to believe in something called climate and racial justice, whatever the hell that is. But if you really believed in something like that, why would you oppose the only source of power known to man that's 100% clean, 100% reliable, can run 24/7, 365, its only meaningful byproduct is water, which could provide cheap, reliable energy for all your fellow citizens? That's because when you think about it, this entire debate is a smokescreen, it's a ruse. It has nothing to do with the environment. It has nothing to do with the economy. It has everything to do with one thing and one thing only. That's control and power. They want control over your reduced standard of living, and they want control of the narrative. So don't give it to them. I appreciate your time. Thank you.